So let's go back to somewhere around middle school, junior high, when we were the age of 10, and think back to how many conflicts you had in your life and how many beliefs that you put into place and how much tension you took on at that point, trying to please peers and them wanting one thing and you sort of trying to figure out what would make your peers like you. And you may have had multiple groups of peers. You may have had friends that were more nerdy and friends that were more cool, and then trying to please your teachers and giving your teachers what they wanted from you, and trying to please your parents and give them another thing. So most of us put into place this sort of like inner voice, or you could even call it a split in your personality. And you can go down that road really far. But basically, this sort of like parent figure, or psychology calls us the superego, that corrects us. So we live by this. And if we're religious, this can actually be God for us. And so this is the voice that's supposed to be keeping us on the right path. But this actually, having a split between these two personalities, is what creates shame and is what creates the need to control. So those two things are really tied. And again, my whole Wheel of Suffering video shows how fear and all these different emotions are intertwined. But what I really want to address is how much I see playing out in spirituality this framework we put into place way back then, and probably way earlier in childhood. But you see the depression start to come in kids' lives around that age, around that middle school age. You see it really fully taken on and matured as a belief. So what I see happening in spirituality is us taking on and keeping the same framework going. So there's a right way to talk about non-duality. Maybe we subscribe to the school of Neo-Advaita, or we subscribe to something completely different. And there's this voice that's constantly like berating us for not thinking the right way, and it's just more thinking. And so rather than giving ourselves the permission or really seeing beyond wisdom itself to go into the feeling and sort of blast through these barriers and these tensions we put into place, we try to live by them. And we try to stay in line with these different barriers, and we have this whole story about what we're trying to become. So it's always this inadequate self who's trying to become something. And this is where we get into having false desires. So when we have desires for fame or for success, very often they're not something that we're actually enjoying. They're not something that we're actually dreaming up as a possibility, but they're an escape, and so they can feel better in a way, but they're actually an escape from seeing this deep feeling of shame, which is in itself covering over these existential feelings of being alone. Loneliness can come up here. And the thing about existential feelings is, to the mind, it seems like it's the worst thing that you can possibly experience. But when it's actually experienced, when it's actually felt, it's transcendent bliss. And so this is the awakening. And it's self-love. It's so simple, and I just see it covered over so many times. And sometimes it's somebody correcting what you say, and while it's true that this is already the case, if thought takes on, it's already the case. The way that thought translates this is that it's a quick fix. And so I'm going to talk about it in a way that it's a really long journey. And I don't mean this in a limiting way whatsoever. I mean it in a freeing way, that it takes as long as it takes, because there is no time. And so time is not a limitation here. And so counterintuitively, the quickest route to get where we're going is to relax and to realize that we can take all the time that we need. And Jesus had this analogy about hearing this message. And so if you're watching this video, if you're into non-duality, I hope you realize what an incredible thing you've stumbled on, how incredibly lucky you are. And it is like, I think it's Nisargadatta Maharaj said, it's like a spark. It's going to consume everything. And so if we can connect with that, if we can connect with the inspiration of that fire, then everything becomes effortless. And this sort of like temptation to go in and shame ourselves for not having it right and not being on the right trajectory somehow doesn't seem so tempting anymore, because we care about how we feel. So Jesus has this parable that, like, whoever hears this message, you have like 3 different types. There's the seed that falls on the rocky soil, and the sun comes out and the roots can't go down deep, and it just wilts and gets scorched. And you have seed that falls amongst the weeds and the thorns and it gets choked out. And you have the seed that falls on the good soil and it bears fruit. So my version of this analogy is like you're a kid who saved his allowance and bought a Rubik's Cube. And he was super excited about having this puzzle to solve. And so he joyously spends his money and buys this puzzle. And then he gets into it and he realizes what he's gotten himself into. He realizes like all his fantasies about how easy it was going to be and how brilliant he is and how he is going to prove it kind of fall apart. And so at that point, you have different personalities, so to speak. And we all have within us the potential to fall into these personalities. So I'm not saying that you fall into one of these groups of people, but we all fall into one of these groups of people at some point. So you have the kid who's like, oh, this is hard. And he kind of like, he doesn't really care. So he throws it at the bottom of the toy box and he goes and eats Doritos and watches SpongeBob and doesn't think of it again. And then you have the kid who gets so frustrated and so angry that he smashes the thing. And then you have the kid who patiently never loses the inspiration he had, the joy with which he bought this thing and wanted to go on this quest. And he knows when to take breaks, he's patient, and he truly enjoys the process of the puzzle. So the perspective here that's like a fatal mistake, and there are no fatal mistakes because you cannot die, is that you think that you have messed up something. So when you buy the puzzle, it's complete, and then you mess it up so you can put it back together again. And if at any point you let the frustration, you lose the connection with the fun, you lose the connection with the challenge. And so doing this puzzle expands your definition of the word fun. So if you lose that connection and you think at some point that you've irreparably messed this thing up, which in the box on the shelf was perfect, that's the fatal error. And this is where the shame comes in. And often we start to see patterns about ourselves and we balk. And that shame is exactly what is, if anything's worthy of shame, it's the feeling of shame. And we all intuitively feel that. And so we get kind of stuck in this law of attraction thinking loop. But if we focus on what we want and we focus on that core reason of buying the puzzle, of the already perfection of it and the desire to solve it just being an expression of that already perfection, this is what we're here for. We are not trying to prove ourselves. And this is what that kind of middle school self-shaming thing is coloring your reality to show back to you, that we're trying to prove ourselves and make it from this place of being incomplete, when in reality we are already whole, and anything that we want to create, any understanding we want to have, all comes as an expression, as direct knowledge, as direct awareness of what we really are, of what already really is. So one of the ways that you actively start aligning with this and trying to like figure out the puzzle, right? So when I was a kid, you bought a Rubik's Cube puzzle and you were sort of on your own. And you might have a friend who could give you some tips or something if you were lucky. But now we have the internet and we have YouTube. And sometimes we can use that as like giving us again that vision that we're not holding ourselves up to. So you start watching a bunch of YouTube videos about people who can solve Rubik's Cubes in like under a minute. And you forget that you wanted to do it. You wanted to give yourself all the time in the world for the joy of figuring out the puzzle. And instead you start just comparing yourselves to others. And so you use this tool properly by taking the tips from it. So here's a tip. Start to pay attention to things and you can start to notice patterns. So there are certain patterns and certain like techniques you can use to solve a Rubik's Cube really fast. So you start to notice certain patterns, and again, like this YouTube video, the whole purpose of it is to try to help you become aware of a pattern. So you notice patterns by how they feel, and instead of just thinking that this is the framework, these are the barriers that we have to live within. These are the walls we built around ourselves that we put up somewhere during childhood to keep ourselves acting socially acceptable and to feel loved and whatever, all these things that we had to do, these conditions that we had to have for love. You start to become really sensitive to when things feel off. And sometimes these are shown to us in really strange ways. So we might think that we might be looking for certain patterns in a certain area, but sometimes the way that we're actually able to see these can be a little bit different. And so you have to, thinking creatively can be really helpful here. So I noticed a few weeks ago that I would like wake up in the night, and sometimes this is when emotions and thoughts would just run amok that didn't feel good. And one of the things that kept coming up that I was really wondering was this very, very old, awful reaction to like losing a stuffed animal or watching someone lose a stuffed animal. So I specifically remember the scene in a show where there's this fire and this disaster and this little boy loses his stuffed bear and he cries. And that, like, I never forgot it, and it traumatized me. And I had a lot of stuffed animals and I wasn't that attached to them, but there was some sort of like emotional thing of something being ripped from you. that was there. And so I didn't give it a ton of thought, but I noticed it. And later I was journaling about some tendencies I had that I was ashamed with, and these seemed very real, and they were kind of like thoughts about people or like things that I thought was clinginess, and I really didn't want to be clingy. So I was journaling about this, and my kid comes up to me, and he has this YouTube video, and it's this guy putting toys through and random stuff through a shredder. And so he puts like this toy through a shredder, and that triggered it and reminded me of it. And so I did a lot of journaling about getting rid of stuffed animals, and I imagined like a kid that's like, they don't want their friends to see stuffed animals in their room. They want to get rid of their stuffed animals, but they still truly love the stuffed animals, but they think they have to get rid of them. And so this perspective is particularly heartbreaking if you take it on in the point, like in spirituality, that you have to let go of these beliefs, right? So it's out of shame that the child is motivated to let go of these stuffed animals. And as I journaled about this, I journaled about the KonMari method. So Marie Kondo, I read her book. I absolutely love her. There's so many amazing parallels to the way that she suggests you tidy up your home and clean up and really start to decide what to let go of and what to keep. And it's by focusing on the life you want and on the things you want to keep. That's really like the whole magic of it. And in one of her books, she talks about getting rid of this stuffed animal. And I think that like Japanese culture, they're more like open about those things. They love like stuffed animals and cute characters more than us, and we may shame ourselves for keeping them around too long more. I don't know. But she said you should cover their eyes. And so it's like the projections that we put on the stuffed animals. And so when I saw all these links of how to truly let go of something with love, with choosing what you do want, and seeing that shame as the blockage, and not going about trying to let go of something out of shame, that was a huge insight for me. And again, like the thought that we should let go of these beliefs because they're an embarrassing thing to hold on to, and we know better, we're into spirituality, is just heartbreaking. So really, it's again like bringing in the law of attraction. Focus on what you do want and make this your true desire. It's when we try to abide by somebody else's standards, or we abide by some sort of role model we've taken on, and we've just given that like super ego voice, that separate self, this voice of what we should be doing, and we kind of like project it out on that we get into trouble. So I find it shocking how often I fall into this trap of shaming myself, because I intellectually understand it. I intellectually understand that awareness is already in the present moment, with no center, with no middle, the middle of which I am, is perfect self-love. And knowing this is an amazing gift. It's the grace of God. And I feel as if I'm letting it down somehow. And I feel as if I'm letting it down somehow when I shame myself. And it's the same exact movement by shaming myself and giving myself reason to shame myself. And an intellectual understanding is such an amazing thing to have found, to have stumbled on. It was not an accident. But don't settle for it. Go deeper. Do not settle for anything less than the actual right now experience of the perfect love that you are.